I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street.
Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with a return guest. Previously, Jeremiah Chechik was on the show a few months ago, last year. We talked about his work in fashion photography. We talked about some of the people he met on his path to and through the fashion industry and how he got into directing such films as Benny and June and National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. So if you missed it, go back and check that out. It was wildly entertaining and super informative. He tells some great stories about some movies that you really enjoy. And in this episode, we talk about some of the things that we didn't talk about last time because we ran out of time. We talk about how Andy Warhol made an impact in his life. When he was at a sort of a crossroads in his career, Andy Warhol helped him in that regard. We talk about some of the work that he did in Milan with Gianni Versace and Giorgio Armani. And of course, we talk about John Hughes. We touch a little bit on Christmas Vacation, but also a fascinating, unproduced John Hughes script that really blew Jeremiah away. And we talk about some really cool things where that's concerned. We just briefly touch on an upcoming television show called Fat Vampire. Can't really tell you any more about that. You'll have to listen. And then finally, we touch on COVID and how that has hindered or helped podcasting and TV and film development, stuff like that. I love talking to Jeremiah. He's so easygoing. He's so much fun to talk to. This was recorded during all the self-distancing due to the coronavirus outbreak. So if that is over by now, woohoo. If not, damn it. But either way, this is my second conversation with director and photographer and now producer Jeremiah Chechik. Welcome back to Fascination Street Podcast, Jeremiah Chechik. How you doing today, Jeremiah?
Doing well, thank you, considering, or as we say here, COVID fine.
COVID fine. You know, what's crazy is that I think the last time I talked to you, COVID had basically just became a thing. And now here we are, you know, what are we, 7 months later and almost 8 months later. And we're still here, still doing COVID.
That's right.
That is so crazy. So the last time we did talk about being born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, but I don't think that we touched on what you wanted to be when you grew up.
I think my initial earliest fantasy was to be an architect. When I was young, my earliest memories of where I thought I could find the creative, I don't know, structure, a job, whatever. This is, you know, going back even pre-high school, I wanted to be an architect. And I think once I found out that the average architect never really gets to do their own work until they reach their mid-50s, and that was kind of a general rule then, I went, well, I'm not going to wait for that. I'll do something else.
That's funny. When I was in middle school and high school, I also wanted to be an architect. And, you know, I was taking drafting classes and architecture classes and things like that in high school. And I think that what appealed to me the most about it was that it was creative, but it was being creative in an analytical way, because you could draw whatever you wanted to, but if it wasn't going to function in reality, then it was garbage. And so that part appealed to me. But then, like you, when I found out that, you know, the best I could hope for the next 20 years was to go work for, you know, some McMansion company, I was like, oh, maybe not.
Exactly how I felt. And it's funny because, you know, we in Venice, California here have had the opportunity of seeing lots of Frank Gehry's work, who is arguably one of the most important architects of our century and absolutely incredible talent. But, you know, it's since been torn down just maybe, 5-8 years ago, or rebuilt. But he built something called Santa Monica Place, which was like, a generic shopping center mall in the middle of downtown Santa Monica. And, he often talked about it as, work for hire, right? That's what they wanted. And even the Frank Gehry's of the world have, had to do that kind of grunt work. So, yeah, it steered me away from architecture, though I have had, thank goodness, in my life, the opportunity of doing massive renovations, building a loft in New York and building 2 houses in Los Angeles over the last couple of decades. And that's been fun. And I would do it again, build another house. I mean, I didn't build it myself, but just in terms of the design. So it's something I still like.
Nice. Maybe all famous architects are named Frank. There is a Frank Lloyd Wright building in Louisville, Kentucky that I'm not sure what's on the first, 20 floors or whatever, something like that. Maybe it's not that big, but anyway, the top floor is a Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. And it is a beautiful building. At the very top, it looks like just a bunch of doilies, like paper doilies. I can't even describe it. It looks amazing, but that's the only Frank Lloyd Wright building I've ever been in. And as far as I know, that's the only building I've ever been in that was designed by a famous architect.
Well, I've had the opportunity of visiting, I would say, 4 or 5 of those houses, including Falling Water and several of his California inventions. And I'm always struck by how low the ceilings are and how small the bedrooms are. Evidently, he was a short man and built in the scale of his own perception. So I always thought that was fun.
That is fun. I remember one time I went to a Pacific War museum that's not far from where I live. And, they have like some of the first submarines that were used back then. And, they were like 1 and 2 man submarines and they're so tiny. The uniforms for the sailors, everything's all tiny. And I asked one of the curators or whatever, why is everything so small? And they were like, well, people were a lot smaller back then. So
yeah, they weren't juicing.
Yeah, that's right. They weren't juicing. We weren't all jacked up on creatine and whatever.
That's it.
Folks, we are going to jump around because there's things we didn't talk about that I want to talk about. So pardon me if we jump around. I know that you and I think maybe somebody with you opened up a space called A Space, right?
This is going back. It wasn't just me. It was a collective of artists in the early 70s, mid 70s in Toronto, Canada. And we started a gallery, and I think the gallery still exists. So
under the same name?
Yeah, A Space. And it's where I had my very first photo shows. No, actually, that's not true. I was reminded that I had my very first photo show was in the lobby of a cinema called the Lumiere, which was one of those every week a different classic movie repertoire cinema.
Sure.
It's almost gone now, those things. I think Tarantino has kept one alive here, the Beverly in Los Angeles. But yeah, that was my first show. My second show was at the gallery, and that was it. That, in many ways, that began a trajectory of a professional photographic life that lasted quite a long time, because in that show, which had achieved some kind of critical success, some bigwig from McCann Erickson, who had been visiting Canada from South Africa, was a big creative director, saw the work, bought one, and maybe a month or two later, it asked me to shoot an ad for McCann Erickson in the style of the work that I had done. And so I had never done anything commercial before, but man, they were paying me as much as I made the entire previous year to do a series of photos. And I thought, well, that's great. I'm not too much of a sellout here. I'm doing the same thing, just being used in a different way. Of course, I have different attitudes now.
Sure.
But then it was really a great opportunity. And out of that evolving relationship, he had an assistant who had a freelance gig for an Italian designer, fashion-wise. And I guess he had asked his boss, who's cheap? Who can do this gig cheap? And so, of course, it was my name that came up. And I was presented with the opportunity of doing a kind of classic fashion shoot in the style of George Hurrell, a photographer of note in the 30s and 40s, early Vogue, very stylized. And so I did my homework, and in my little funky loft one day, a bunch of models showed up and a bunch of makeup and hairstylists showed up, and I kind of hobbled together the lights. I rented the gear because I didn't really own what I thought was the correct gear, and did the pictures. And they paid me very, very little. But the deal that I made was, listen, I'll shoot it inexpensively and cheap, but I need a credit on every image that goes out in the ads. So I want my name there, photo by. And they agreed. And about 4 or 5 months later, I was walking on the street and happened to look up, and there was a huge billboard, and there was a gorgeous fashion shot in that kind of 40s style. And, right alongside it was my photo credit. And moments later, a bus rolled by with big ad on the side of it with the same, image, and then back of magazine covers anyway. It just exploded. And of course, my phone started ringing off the hook as like this new fashion photographer. And so I didn't even know it hit me. But I started to get work in that way. I thought, maybe I should try and kind of get myself, a book together. And by book, I meant a portfolio, since people seem to be wanting to see more of my work. So made an arrangement with the local modeling agencies, and I work with certain friends who would do hair and makeup. We started to shoot a bunch of stuff, and I started to get work. And one of the gigs sent me to Milan, where I was discovered there by Vogue and had a nice, solid career as a Vogue fashion photographer till I moved back to Canada, then to New York. And through that and that kind of whole process, that eventually evolved to a commercial director, primarily in fashion. But then I really started to back away from that and say that I wouldn't do any more fashion commercials. I would just do storytelling. And my experience at university, I went to McGill and studied theater there. And so I had a background in storytelling and dramaturgy and staging. So that work kind of came easily to me. I was a photographer the whole time. So lighting, composition, and then later blocking. And it seemed to be in many ways easier because you didn't even have to carry the lights around. You could just say, guys, can we move that light? That seemed to be really, really good. I remember my first gig when I went up to the light to move it. 5 guys from my ANSI just jumped on me and said, no, man, you can't touch that light. That's our job. And I was going, I think I'm going to like this job directing.
So back to that person that worked for McCann Erickson, they, saw your work and brought you on. And well, they offered you more money than you had seen in some time. But then that other person who wanted you to go shoot an Italian designer's stuff, do we know the name of that Italian designer?
Oh, God. I'm blanking.
Really? It's not like Gianni Versace or somebody?
No, though it was Versace and Armani who made it possible for me to meet with the editors at Vogue in Italy. Maybe a year later, I did work for Versace. It was his last year at Complice as a designer before he went out on his own. And Armani had a studio. They both let me their studios to work in Milan. And it introduced me to the agents there, certainly the modeling agents. And they loved my work and sent me to Vogue. And I thought I was just there sort of as a courtesy and a visit. I was happy to just check it out because Italian Vogue was, and still is, a real interesting. It's half art, half commerce. The advertising was all by the designers rather than the retailers, which American Vogue was. So there was less dependence on sort of a commercial look and more on an expression from their photographers. But I came out of it with a gig, so it was kind of nice.
So how did you end up meeting those two? How does that work? Did they just call you up and say, hey, I like your style, or?
No. That work was originally it was a big, Bloomingdale's-y kind of store to do their fall collection, which was in Milan. This is early, just when the collections are announced. So they sent me to do the early work, and the early work, there's several designers, but the two in particular they liked was Armani, who was just really starting to hit it very, very big in Italy and hadn't become quite the international sensation he would be in, just a moment later when he did those deconstructed men's suits. And Versace, who hadn't gone out on his own. So I had met both of them early days. They were very kind and very generous and very welcoming. And so it was through the gig that I was doing their clothes. That's how I met them.
Oh, gotcha.
So that's how that worked.
So they were easy to get along with?
Oh, they were fabulous, yeah.
Because, you picture, or at least in TV and film, you see the Italian designer who's just like a nightmare to work with and constantly yelling at everybody. So it wasn't like that at all.
Well, I wasn't working for them.
Well, that's a good point.
In other words, if I worked for them as an assistant or whatnot, who knows? Though I suspect it was not that way with those guys. They had enormous talent and understanding of the nature of, the history of fashion and design and the likes of that. But in my experience, they were there just to be wind in my sails to make the images look as good as possible with the kind of styling that they were involved in at that time.
Awesome.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
Magic 8 Ball. Should people visit disabilityshirts.com?
Yes, I am sure.
This is Sammy Haney. I play Esperanza on Netflix's Raising Dion, and you're listening to the Fascination Street podcast. If you are looking for some shirts with inclusive messages, check out my store, disabilityshirts.com.
Let's get back into it.
How long were you in Italy? I know you lived there.
Yeah, off and on 4 or 5 years, and then decided that I really, when you work as an editorial photographer, even doing advertising in Italy, you really don't make very much money. You live a great lifestyle, don't get me wrong, and you travel all over the world. It's a lot of fun, believe me. Great memories from that. But, you're not really feeding the bank account at all. And so if you want to make money, you take that portfolio that you've shot for many, many years. I don't know how it is now, but then New York was the center of advertising. So when you have your portfolio and an agent there that's going, I have this Vogue photographer who wants to do some work, it becomes a lot easier. Then you're charging solid, day rates to do the same kind of work.
So then what precipitated your move back? I think you went from Milan to New York. Is that right?
I probably moved back to Canada first and then got a visa you need to work in the U.S. permanently. And so then that began a back and forth. And my life was really in New York, but I had to leave because I applied for immigration. Again, I don't know what it is now, but I immigrated to the U.S. You had to leave the country while they processed your application. So I moved back to Toronto. And when I moved back, that was the opportunity for me to start directing because, Toronto, which had kind of a local market, and me coming with an international portfolio, I went to the front of the line pretty fast in terms of getting hired, at least from perception. I'm not even talking about talent if I had any, but at least the perception was that I was good, and I didn't do anything to discourage that. So I had a lot of opportunities, and those very same people that had encouraged me to begin a career in commercial photography were those very people who are also doing commercials, and they embraced that and affiliated myself with a production house. And pretty soon I was pretty much of an exclusive director of commercials. And, I met my wife in that period. My visa came due, my green card. We moved to New York the day after. And obviously, I was working in New York as a commercial director for many years again, and then worked a lot in Hollywood and, back and forth doing big jobs, in big studios. And, New York was a little bit different in terms of the unions. It was a very complicated period in New York for the film business. There was a lot of fleeing of companies to the West Coast, and I was among them. And so moved to the West Coast and continued to do commercials. And out of that, started to build relationships with the studios and developing material. And the first real opportunity was a movie that was based on the Apollo Theater in New York. So as soon as I got that gig, I had to go back to New York and spend 3 or 4 months basically living at the Apollo. And that was absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, sounds like a tough job. Living at the Apollo sounds amazing.
But we developed a really interesting film. It was with Amblin, with Spielberg, and it was to be done through Warner's. And in that period, developed the screenplay, which was a very unusual screenplay. It was based on real people and acting and just a very blurred vision of what's real and what's not. Long story there, but I wanted to do it very inexpensively because I just felt I would have more control. At the critical time, the studio wanted to do a more expensive version, a big version with movie stars. Not movie stars, but musical stars. They had said, listen, why don't we get Whitney Houston to play one of the leads? You know her. You've worked with her on commercials, which I had. I'd done a whole series of Diet Coke commercials with Whitney, and others. And they thought, oh, this will be really, really fun. And I didn't particularly like the idea because the Apollo Theater, especially Amateur Night at the Apollo, is all about great talent going on stage and having the community thumbs up or thumbs down. And sometimes you had people who were absolutely brilliant, just have an off night and be booed off the stage with the hook. Other times you had someone who wasn't that great technically, but whose innocence or passion was so great the audience embraced them and they would just go on and explode. And other times you'd have just geniuses emerge out of the community and explode. And I wanted to kind of create the feeling. You wouldn't know if somebody was going to make it. And of course, Whitney Houston is playing the lead. And obviously, she's going to, there's no drama there.
Right.
So I walked away from that and they went back to developing it. They eventually came back around to my way of seeing, but the problem is that by that time, the Apollo and its commercial sensibility had kind of emerged. There was a television show and the kind of special aspect of it had gone away. And so I think it had moved past its due date, as it were. Of course, now, as a white man, I don't think I would ever really have been, not allowed, but I wouldn't be the first choice to direct a movie like that.
Well, now, no, yeah.
But anyway, at that point, but out of that, I established a pretty solid relationship with a lot of the executives and such at Warner's. And they started to really kind of embrace me as a filmmaker, even though I hadn't made a film. I'd gone back to making commercials, but they had been sending me scripts. And in fact, I remember they sent me a Clint Eastwood movie. They said, this is going to be a big hit with Clint Eastwood, like you to do it. And I read the script and I said, guys, you're pulling my chain because no way the studio is going to make this movie. And no way is Clint Eastwood ever going to make a movie called Pink Cadillac. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Right? That's how naive I was. I'm sure Clint regrets it too, but at any rate, I didn't do it. I soon realized they were sending me their slate. And one of the scripts they had sent me was an early draft that John Hughes had written, which was the third in line to Christmas Vacation. At that time, I hadn't seen either of the first two. And, that wasn't my strong point. Broad comedy with Chevy Chase was not something that I had ever imagined myself directing. I was much more into the world of, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I'm talking about the original Sullivan's Travels and doing serious work and moody work and whatnot. But it was a firm offer and the script was absolutely hilarious. It was so good. It was so fun. I was very conflicted, and I remember phoning Kathy Kennedy and just saying, Kathy, should I do this? Should I not? What? She said, the streets are littered with directors who are just waiting for their, quote, perceived perfect project. But this is a real movie. It's going to be, released at Christmas. It's a bona fide movie. Go do it. Do your best work. And so I embraced it fully. John and I worked, he was a great comedic mentor to me. Loved him. And I know, there's a lot of stories of how difficult he was to work with. He wasn't that way with me, but I just had a great experience with him, and I embraced it. It was a difficult shoot in some ways and a very easy shoot in others, but that really began that process. And, I was happy the movie struck a chord and the movie was quite successful and still lives today.
Yeah, it still strikes a chord. And when you were making the decision to do that movie, that was back before, I guess, we realized that holiday-themed movies get put on repeat by every TV channel in America when those holidays come around,
Yeah, I wasn't actually thinking of that then. I also wasn't thinking that I had to make a movie that reflected my personal visual style. Thank goodness. I really said I want to do the movie in the style that the movie wants to be, which is kind of a Currier and Ives or Rockwellian flip of the, kind of classic suburban American dream, and do it in that style and make every decision in a kind of classic style. So, of course, I had studied a lot of the films of Leo McCarey, Preston Sturges, Billy Wilder, Howard Hawks, those giants of basic comedy direction, but most of them had done not only comedy, but some of them had done amazing drama, war films, comedy, noir. So they just saw directing as something that would enable a screenplay to kind of find its level and just move towards heightening that. And I took that as a kind of a career path that probably was fiscally not a great thing to do at that point, because very soon after, directors seem to have had to specialize. If you're a comedy director, you do comedy. If you're a thriller director, you do thrillers. And that, I think, pretty much exists today. I always saw directing as something that was a little more broad as a skill. And that's worked for me, and it's worked against me if we're being analytical about a career. I mean, I'm not complaining.
Sure.
I've had great success and, continue to enjoy the kind of evolving state of the kind of filmed media.
Well, I think it's good to be standing on the balls of your feet, ready to sort of pivot in whichever direction the ball is going, so to speak. So I think that's really cool. Now, John Hughes wrote that it was a short story that movie was based on, right?
Yeah.
Now, that leads me to a question. I heard a tale of an unproduced John Hughes script that you read and it blew you away.
Yes, I know the script. It was called The Bee.
And so it still has never been made?
To my knowledge, it's never been made.
How come you don't go after it?
I don't know. What a great idea.
I mean, if it blew you away, and you still remember it all these years later.
I do. It's very, very simple. And actually, I wonder what happened to that script. The problem now is who has the rights? Did they revert? You know what I mean? It's complicated. But he said it to me, and it was something we discussed doing. I don't ever remember, you get busy, he gets busy, we do different things, and boom. But I should investigate.
Yes, I agree. I think you should, and I'll just take a thank you in the credits. That's all.
You'll get it.
Thank you.
After 10 years of trying to get it made, probably.
Yeah, no kidding, right? So I know that you spent some time, again, going back a while back, you spent some time with Andy Warhol.
I wouldn't describe it that way.
Well, you spent more time with him than I did.
I just met him at one of those kind of art party gathering kind of thing. This is, again, early. I don't think I had made the jump to commercial work totally. I was kind of in that interregnum period of doing commercial work and my art. I was doing printmaking. Anyway, bottom line is, I ran into him. He was friends of mine from the New York art scene, and I forget where we met, but I remember having a very, very intense conversation with him about the difference or how to approach commercial work versus pure artistic work. Because if anyone could answer that question for me, it was Andy Warhol, right? I mean, there's never been a better human equipped to deal with the relationship between crass commercialism and pure art.
Right.
And, in that conversation, he inspired me to think of work as the work and not so much as how the work would be perceived. Now, I'm not sure that that's right anymore or not, but it gave me permission to go full steam ahead on commercial work while in my own brain maintaining a kind of artistic sensibility. And I think I've kept that alive through film. Obviously, doing fashion at that time was closer to it because I had more control. And it wasn't that I was doing kind of bland typewriter catalogs. The work that I was doing had mood and tone and feel and emotion, I hope. I wouldn't exaggerate it much more than it happened to be a turning point in my decision making about what direction I would go as a creative person. So I had met and spent a little time with him. It's not that he was a friend. I wouldn't even describe him as an acquaintance, but someone who I had crossed paths with on several occasions. And so that we recognized each other, obviously, and could have a real substantive conversation.
Well, I think that in the spirit of, the 7 people we meet in heaven who made an impact of our lives or whatever, I feel like he might be one of those people who, sort of helped you at a crossroads, sort of make a decision and tell you that it was okay to break the rules or whatever.
Yeah, it wasn't even about really rules. It was about where does a creative person, where does an artist or someone who defines themselves as an artist find their true calling in a commercial reality where your work itself is being exhibited, for lack of a better term, with the intention of selling something other than the work itself.
Gotcha.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
Hi, guys. I'm Vinny Tartarich. I'm the guy that has the Fitness Confidential podcast and the book by the same name. I've started a few companies, but I just started a company called NSNG Foods, and our first product is Ultra Fat. What's that? You say fat? Oh, yeah. It's got fat in it. It's got ultra fat. And the reason we call it ultra fat is because it also has electrolytes. So this is something you want to take when you're on the move. Taking the nation and the world by storm. We have the coffee almond with coconut and vanilla. We also have the one with coconut, vanilla, and almonds with no coffee. So you can go check it all out, nsngfoods.com. Now go listen to my good friend Steve Owens because he knows what he's talking about.
Let's get back into it.
Do you still shoot fashion?
No.
Is there a reason?
Is there a reason? Well, there's probably a good reason. Nobody's asked me to in 20 years. At some point when I made Diabolique, Vogue had approached and there was a conversation of me doing a fashion spread of Sharon Stone, Isabella Gianni for Vogue, the two of them. And I thought that would be really, really fun. But by the end of the movie, the hatred between the two of them was, I don't know if it's hatred, but there was antagonism, that's for sure. And so it fell apart.
Gotcha. Well, last time we spoke, you helped dispel a rumor that you had replaced Chris Columbus on Christmas Vacation. Thank you for setting that straight. You set it straight.
No, though I think that I'm going back to the deep recesses of my memory. Chris Columbus was definitely in the mix to direct. It was between me and him. And I think Warner's initially, no, they had sent me the script, so they wanted me to do it. I hadn't met Chevy. John, I don't think wanted Chris Columbus. I don't know why. Chevy definitely wanted me when he met me. So I had to get along with all of them. But I forget. But anyway, I got it. So that's it. But it wasn't like I didn't replace him.
That was sort of a rumor that was sort of out there. So I appreciate you clearing that up. But I did stumble upon another rumor, and I was wondering if you could help me debunk this one.
Sure.
At any time, were you in the mix to be the director of Seven?
Oh, well, that's absolutely true. Not only director, this is a long, sad story. I developed the screenplay for Seven.
Really?
Yeah. So I was in development. I don't want to say development hell because it was fun. It was for an Italian company. We had taken it really, really, really very far. And I had a manager at the time who had kind of gotten herself in the mix and was a producer somehow. And I think she brokered the deal and la-di-da. Anyway, went very, very far with it. And then what happened was, and it was, I kicked myself because it was the only time that in making the deal I had not followed what my lawyer had recommended that I do in terms of my deal, because I trusted these people. Well, what happened is, as we started to move forward, I remembered it. I wanted to do with Johnny Depp and Paul Newman. I had done a commercial with Paul and had a really good relationship with him at that time. And Johnny wanted to do it. Paul would have done it. I thought they would have been great together. Not that Morgan Freeman was not mind-blowingly fabulous, by the way. Anyway, the company went bankrupt. All their assets went into a pile. Now we're talking like 2 years, so it had just vanished into the ether. When it emerged with another film company or another producer film company. I'm going back to the legal aspect of this with my manager as producer. And at that point, they had hired Fincher to do it. The script was pretty much intact, though. The third act was a lot darker in my version.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Yes, believe it or not. Because in my version, it was really all about the 7 deadly sins and how the darkness really transformed the protagonist into the worst that he could be.
There's not a copy of that screenplay laying around, is there?
Maybe I got it somewhere. I don't know. I'd have to dig deep.
Oh, man.
But it's probably somewhere. But it's probably not digitized.
Right.
But anyway, that's one that really did break my heart because I loved it. And by the way, I thought Fincher did a spectacular job with it. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have cast it quite that way.
Right.
But that's me. The romance, for what it was a lot more complicated. But overall, I'm a fan of the movie. I mean, I liked the movie. I thought it was great. The first time I saw it, I was kind of a little shocked at how abruptly it ended because there was a whole other chapter that really came about that was really very, very deep. A lot of research in terms of the Middle Ages and all of that. But my history with it is both sad and happy. I mean, we did a very successful, I think, development of it. And I think David did a great job, and I got screwed out of a huge amount of money.
Yeah, you did.
So there you go. That's Hollywood.
Did you get any money at all on that?
I probably got a development fee.
Sure. Now, I know that you said you were picturing Depp and Newman, but who did you picture for the female?
I think Gwyneth.
Oh, cool. Now, I know that you said, you had a good relationship with Paul Newman, and this is just an aside, so take it or leave it. But the comedian and podcaster Adam Carolla, who lives in L.A., he is a huge fan of Paul Newman as a race car driver, and he owns like all of Paul Newman's race cars. And he has like a little it's kind of a museum warehouse over there in Glendale where he has all of them displayed, and he's had his team restore them back to their racing days. And he actually takes them out and races them. And he's also done at least one documentary on Paul Newman's race car driving part of his life. So I just thought you might like to know that. Paul
had a Volvo. It looked like, one of those boxy Volvos. I think it was like cream colored. Looked like nothing, but it had like a 427 Hemi engine in it. And he would like roll up to a corner, with some kind of hot car, and he would like vroom, 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 right? And just like blast off. Very, very cool. We did a commercial for American Express where it would only run on the Super Bowl one time. So it was for his charity. We got to write it together and produce it together. And it was just great.
That's an awesome memory. Back to that Volvo, that souped up, inconspicuous Volvo. I think the legend has it that David Letterman saw it and wanted it. And so Paul Newman made him one also.
That's cool.
What can you tell me about Fat Vampire?
Well, I can't talk too much about it. It's been set up at NBC Universal. We have the pilot developed. We're currently developing more scripts while we wait for the COVID protocols, orders, etc., to kind of clear the air for next year. It's based on a series of books, and that's all I'm going to really say about it. It's an active project.
Of course. Now, is that through Modern Story?
Yeah, Harley Payton and I, great writer, formed a company maybe a year or so ago, and we've been accumulating a lot of projects. We've had some good fortunes starting to set them up, develop them onward, and, on we go. So we're using this kind of period of production and activity for writing and development.
Genius. So Modern Story is a production house?
Yeah, it's a production company. The Modern Story Company.
Okay. Well, maybe the Modern Story Company can get to work on finding that that long-lost script or short story. The Bee?
What I do know about it is John was going to direct it. That was his intention. And he had sent it to me. He said, what do you think of this? It's great. But what happened, I think they put it into turnaround. It ended up to be like $50 million, which I couldn't understand. But certainly in today's world, it would not be that expensive to make. But I'm not sure if it ended up at Fox or it ended up at Warner's. But I will get to the bottom of it. There must be a lot of money against it, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, maybe somebody forgot about it, and it'll be a boon. It'll be a mitzvah.
I'll look for it.
Nice. Now, I know that you have a podcast, and it's called The Future of Photography, and it's you and 3 or 4 other folks that are all over the world. And I know that since everybody's all over the place, scheduling was a little rough sometimes to get everybody together. How has COVID, pandemic, quarantine helped or hindered the scheduling of making that show?
It's helped a great deal because we're all like pretty much around our houses. We're not all out on shoots at various times or traveling around the world or at inaccessible places. And that makes it a lot harder. But now we're pretty consistent on our scheduling, and we do one a week.
Well, that's awesome. Good to hear. Glad some cool things have come out of this.
Oh, no, listen, I never stopped kind of working. Again, as a photographer, I've come kind of full circle back to my kind of more pure artistic roots. And I'm working on a book of my work. I've had an exhibit the year before last at a big design museum in Buenos Aires, a solo show here in Los Angeles, a show gallery, working on other folios,
Well, cool. Speaking of putting a book together of your work, the last time we spoke, you were putting a book together with Nazarelli Press. Is that the same book you were just talking about?
Yeah, of course, everything's slowed down now and, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, still working on it.
Still on track, though, right? Still going to be a thing?
Oh, yeah, it's a thing.
Nice. Well, when it does come out, if I buy one and send it to you, will you sign it for me?
Sure. Make it less valuable, but...
Oh, how dare you. Well, I know that I've taken up just about an hour of your day today, Jeremiah. Before we head out, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about today?
Well, not being like one of these people who wakes up in the morning really dying to talk about myself. Not really. On the photography side, Future Photography, tfopnow.com is where you dial into that one. Or, of course, on your podcast provider of choice. So there's that. And then there's, I've been learning how to create landscapes in Unreal Engine and World Creator and ZBrush and Unity.
How is that going? Learning new technology?
It's slow for me, but good.
Nice.
If I was 22, it'd be much faster.
Right.
But I love it. I know where my weaknesses are and my strengths are in terms of technologies and select them to accommodate.
Gotcha. Are you familiar with the actor Jason Lee?
Yeah.
This is, again, a little bit of a sideline, but I believe that he basically retired from acting and focuses full time on photography. And I think he even moved to a small town outside of Dallas. And I think that, again, this is just me being, I guess, a pedestrian, but I think that considering both of you have similar backgrounds and that you still are in Hollywood and he was 100% in Hollywood and then, sort of taken off on this photography path. And I think he's got a couple of books of photography out already or whatever.
Yeah, no, he's good. I know his work. They're very kind of graphic and minimalist and really, he's got a great eye.
Do you guys have guests on The Future of Photography?
We generally don't. I mean, we're 4 of us, so
yeah. Well, that's a good point.
We've learned how to interact in a podcast, but now we're doing. Even though we're an audio podcast, we've started to record it in video and put it up on YouTube, and it's a lot easier when you can kind of see each other, just in terms of interruptions or not.
Right. Doing what I do, I've noticed that as well.
Yeah.
It's a lot different when you're in person and then also different when you're doing a video conference and then, something wholly different when it's just audio.
Yeah.
Yeah, visual cues are out the window.
But it's fun. I guess the only other things that we haven't really covered, I mean, the world of television and how television itself has and is replacing theatrical motion pictures as the storytelling form. I'm not sure that the experience is exactly the same, but certainly super accessible and easy to deliver the goods without spending $150 million promoting it, but the audiences are segmented. But the freedoms are amazing, and there's such incredibly great television that's being made. And in films, there's a narrowing of storytelling, certainly in America. I mean, I don't think that that's true all over the world. I think where you have state-sponsored filmmaking, it tends to be a little more artistic or personal, but there are issues with that too on the political front.
Sure.
Big movies require 4-quadrant access generally, so that stories have to be more generalized, I think, and hence you have the DC universe and the Marvel universe and whatnot.
Right.
So you have those kinds of things operating on the Uber front, and with some great gifted filmmakers who've made billion-dollar profits, or certainly income for the studios allowed to do more personal work. But television seems to be where the action is right now, and that's where I find myself.
Well, I think it's a good place to be because, like you said, we're in an age of some of the most exemplary storytelling that's ever been on television. I think it probably started at least a few years ago, like when AMC got into the game with Mad Men and Breaking Bad and stuff like that. And then, now Netflix and Amazon, they've got the money, so they have the development budget to get these things rolling. But it's one thing if you can watch a 2-hour movie that's fantastic, but it's quite another thing if, you can sit at home and instead of just spending 2 hours with these characters, you get to spend sometimes 10 hours, for a season or whatever. Like my wife and I just finished watching Ratchet on Netflix, which is, sort of the pre-story of Nurse Ratchet. And there's no way they could do that in a movie theater. I mean, it was phenomenal.
No, I watched the pilot. I thought it was so good. I didn't think I would like it, actually. I thought it would be too over the top, and I'm not sure where it's going, but I thought the pilot was so good. I'm going to keep watching it.
I definitely think you should. And when my wife was like, oh, let's watch that, I was like, what in the hell? We're not an American Horror Story kind of a household, and that's who did it was those people and Ryan Murphy. And it was phenomenal. We watched the whole thing, and we watched basically one episode every night, and it was well worth it. It was well worth your time. You should enjoy it.
Well, personally, my current recommendation is The Boys.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, I've heard a lot about it, but not from anybody that I care about their opinions. So it's good to hear.
Oh, I think it's one of the most amazing shows that I've seen. It's a show that defines this moment in time.
Oh.
And the acting is great. You know what it's about, right?
I have no idea what it's about.
Oh, just imagine that the Justice League of America are the most corrupt and horrible people corporately that you can imagine. It is turning superhero tropes completely inside out.
Oh, that sounds fresh.
It's where, quote, Superman is the darkest, most evil character you could ever imagine, and powerful. So I could not recommend it more. It's so good. My wife, who doesn't like horror and all of that kind of stuff, she's also really into it. So there you go. Highly recommend.
Well, that is a fantastic recommendation. Thank you. Well, Jeremiah, thank you again for joining us for a part 2. I really appreciate it, man. And maybe we'll keep in touch. I can't wait to see that book.
Me too.
And if you happen to trip over a box in the garage and that screenplay of 7 falls out, sign that bad boy and mail it right on over. I want to read that.
If I can find it, I will.
All right. Thank you, Jeremiah. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. As always, thanks for listening, Streetwalkers. And don't forget, follow the show on Twitter at FascinationSTPD, on Instagram at Fascination Street Pod. Follow the podcast page on Facebook at Fascination Street Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and rate us on iTunes.
Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.